I went on the internet and Googled Hank, and I thought, holy crimoly, I couldn't begin to say all the stuff that this guy writes about and stuff. He's a blogger and an author, and today he's going to tell us about the article specifically about someone who lived here in Pacifica back in the day, and I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to let you tell us about it.
Okay.
So, please welcome Hank Chapot.
I know you guys want to talk about Dolly first, so here's the house. There's the photograph of it that shows, I'm pretty sure she owned it. It still has the same color scheme that she had at the time. She plied her trade for a long time in San Francisco without getting in trouble. But when the 1935-36 scandal happened and the city hired a private investigator to investigate the police department, her name started showing up in tapped wire conversations at the McDonough Brothers bail bonds business. The McDonough Brothers were said to be the inventors of the modern bail bonds business. Their father had a saloon. He was a former jailer for the city in this building. He's in the Hall of Justice. The top floor was the jail. And he opened a saloon a block away, and he noticed that lawyers were taking a percentage of the money that they loaned out for bail. Bail in those days was $5 or $10 for petty crimes. So the McDonoughs started loaning money for bail and taking a percentage, which the New York Times and a number of other sources said was the invention of the modern bail bond business. And they became millionaires. Pete and Tom McDonough, they were Cow Hollow raised. They had their first business in the Tenderloin, where after the earthquake, there was a Hall of Justice, and the police department was on Eddy Street. So they were, of course, had an office directly across the street. And then when this Hall of Justice was built, they moved to Kearny Street, 1 block away. So there's Dolly in her house. This is a picture that was taken by a call reporter that talked his way into the house. When Dolly was a fugitive, the house was visited by, they said, thousands of motorists went down on weekends just to drive by your house. A call reporter and a photographer bribed their way in, and I'll go back, we'll get onto that in a little while, but they bribed their way in and took photographs of Dolly's bedroom and her, she had a huge doll sitting on the bed and stuff. So anyway, so I thought I would give you a hint of Dolly, but we got to go back to the police graft and corruption. So that's the old Hall of Justice on Kearny, and right in the foreground is the corner, which is what they called the McDonough Brothers bail bonds office, where the police often would arrest somebody, take them into the corner first, and then take them over and book them at the Hall of Justice. There's Pete. He was a greeter on Kearny Street. He stood out front every morning and waved and shook hands and was quite active in city politics. He was a Republican, fairly conservative, but he was much more involved in the police and the courts than he was in City Hall. Okay, this is a guy, that's John Lewis. He was giving the speech at the Rotary Club, and he dropped the hint that the cops had hundreds of thousands of dollars in unclaimed funds, and that also he mentioned that a madam had signed them up for Social Security and had been trying to write off her payoffs to the police on her taxes, which the IRS was only a few years old. And I think he was talking about Dolly. So the city went all crazy, and the papers started a circulation war over, who are the corrupt cops and who are the grafters. Mayor Angelo Rossi was the mayor at the time. He had succeeded Jim Rolfe, who was San Francisco's most popular mayor in a long time, plus longest serving mayor. But Rossi was egged on into putting up some $25,000 to hire a private investigator. Oh, there's Lewis again. He's the IRS agent with the loose lips. He just opened his mouth and started the whole thing going. So they immediately started ordering, they called them resorts, but they started raiding brothels and pinball parlors, gambling dens, after hours nightclubs, and drinking establishments. Because the citizens of San Francisco liked their open town, but they didn't want it talked about in the papers. San Francisco is famous for, after perhaps New York and New Orleans, as being an open city. The seaport about 3 to 5 men, 3 women for every 5 men at the time in the 30s. And prostitution was rampant. So they started cracking down on gambling houses. And this is just another headline. This one policeman had $110,000 in his bank account when he died, and his whole family came after the money, and so it became a big deal. And that's Dolly's business card in the middle. It says D. Fine Contractor. I have a better shot of that. There's Pete and Tom McDonough. They were, businessmen. Really, they were straightforward and honest and corrupt to the core, but they ran their business like a business. This is the first time Dolly shows up in the paper. They hired a private investigator, who you'll see in a minute. These are a little out of order, who tapped the McDonough's phones. They called them the whispering wires. And Dolly's phone calls into the McDonough's bail bonds office put her on the radar, so she was subpoenaed to come in. And there's 50 pages of her testimony in the San Francisco history room of the downtown library, where she went in there and denied everything. She said she didn't remember, she didn't make those phone calls. And I could read you some of the transcripts if we have some time. But they were phone calls about setting up raids and how come you weren't home last night? They sent in 2 officers. And, do you want a girl? I've got one that's looking for work, and all this kind of stuff, where she was on the phone to the McDonough brothers, but she said, I don't know who I talked to down there. How many times have you been arrested? 7 times in the last 2 years. And she'd call up, who do you call to get your bail? And, but she really continued to deny and just say, I don't remember. And her lawyer later on was Jake Ehrlich. He's a pretty famous San Francisco lawyer. He said that her performance at the grand jury didn't convince anybody, and they wanted a little bit of mea culpa or a little bit of honesty from her, but she just stonewalled them. There she is. She was arrested for something, I'm not sure, but that's the previous lawyer, Byron Parker. And Dolly always came to court covering her face or hidden. Later on, she came with veils from her head to her feet. Okay, then the police started to go on trial because the grand jury was doing investigations, and the cops were taking the fifth. They're saying, one cop said he found the money in a wood pile. Another one said it was his wife's, $100,000. I mean, San Francisco police bought homes in St. Francis Wood. They owned blocks of Divisadero Street, and they were getting paid $200 to $300 a month as officers, but they were pulling down about $1 million a year in graft payoffs. Okay, jail cells awaiting, and this became big headlines. Like I said, the newspapers were doing a circulation war, and it was, the whole city was shocked to find out that police were corrupt. Here's another shot I really kind of liked. It says, falling stars clutter up the San Francisco skyline. I don't know how they got this photograph, unless a press photographer must have had friends in the police department, because those were badges that were turned in by cops that were suspended. A lot of them disappeared. A number of them were, I don't think anybody did any jail time. And then there are also tons of pretty amusing political cartoons. This one says, grand jury, the Mayor Rossi trying to get money out of the Board of Supervisors to continue the investigation. So the city hired Edwin Atherton. It was a former G-man who quit the FBI under somewhat of a cloud. He had 10 investigators that he hired, and they spent almost a year. After about 4 or 5 months, went to the papers and said, since everybody wants to know who I am, my name's Edwin Atherton, and if anybody has any information, people started sending him letters and lists of prostitution houses all over the city. Formerly of the United States Department of Justice. It was called the Bureau of Investigation before it was called the FBI. Okay, he released his report on March 16, 1937. 70 pages with names and locations. They called it the Atherton Report, but it really was a criminal investigation by the grand jury. He released it on St. Patrick's Day, which I think was a dig at the Irish Catholic community in San Francisco, which the police department, the McDonoughs, the whole city was run by, the police and the courts were run by Irish Catholics. And I think he was an East Coast WASP, went to Georgetown Law School. I think he was, I can't believe he didn't do it on purpose. So the report was published in the Chronicle and the Examiner as a special supplement. And everybody, of course, said it's all lies. That's Edwin again. You know, this mayor, everybody was all, ready to bite. So a police graft report rocked San Francisco officials. It was pretty notorious. This says, Atherton report hits Shumate and McDonough. Shumate was one of the police commissioners for a long time. San Francisco had a police commission with 3, and all 3 of the commissioners ended up resigning in disgrace because they all had loans from the McDonough brothers. Dr. Shumate, who owned pharmacies all over San Francisco, there's still a bunch of Walgreens in places where his pharmacies were. He had a $20,000 loan from the McDonough that he'd had for 20 years and he'd never paid a cent on. Whispering wires exposed open way so they started indicting police officers and dragging them in front of the grand jury. There were a couple of trials, but most of them just resigned and took their money and went fishing. This is a police officer explaining to the grand jury where his fortune comes from. And you can see he rode in on a magic carpet, or he found a solid gold mountain, or he did a billion to 1 shot at the racetrack, or it rained coin, it's everything. And this is another one of those, they asked Atherton for proof, and this is just more of the papers had a field day with this. It went on for months too, and we'll get to Dolly pretty soon because she was only dragged in front of the grand jury, testified, denied everything, but then a little while later something terrible happened to her that put her back in the papers. Here Atherton published a list of 135 resorts, which people had reported to him. They'd been there for a long time, and it's funny, I had this list, I sent it out on the internet and somebody geo-mapped it. So you can see a map of San Francisco with all the locations. A lot of them were on 6th Street. They were mostly downtown, but a lot in the Tenderloin. And these are long established brothels that pretty much, it was a place, it wasn't like prostitution is today. Dolly she had 2 apartment buildings. She provided homes for the women who worked for her, and maid service and cooks and stuff, and they lived there for a long time. And they call it the taxi trade because there would be taxis lined up out front all day and all night. Oh, and then they tried to hand it off to the Attorney General, Ulysses S. Webb, who was the longest serving Attorney General in California and a virulent racist. He tried to, he pushed the alien land laws against Asians owning property in California, but he wouldn't take it, or the investigation. And so this just says that he was, the graft investigation mess, that he was asleep at the wheel or playing possum. There's another couple shots of Pete, good-looking, fine, upstanding businessman. He went to church every day at St. Mary's. There's another shot of the corner. This is after it closed, when it was the end of the McDonough era. There's another one. Atherton called him the fountainhead of corruption. So here's the fountain, where with the snake on it, and it says leaking wire evidence. It says they called him the phony fixer, and this one just says, "Can't you fix it, Pete?" And he was jailed for contempt of the grand jury because he refused to talk and he refused to take the fifth. But he was only in jail for 2 or 3 days, and they worked out a deal where he just came in and answered 3 questions, and then they let him go. And this is how they started to portray him as, the big boss of Kearny Street. The corner is a little too close to the Hall of Justice. It was about a block away. Okay, then everybody resigned. The police commissioner resigned. The mayor was close to resigning because he didn't have any debts to the McDonoughs, but this is Dr. Shumate in the middle. The other 2 police commissioners also had loans from the McDonoughs, so everybody had to resign. And then Brady, Matthew Brady, was the district attorney of San Francisco. There he is right there saying, I had nothing to do with it. But he had a loan from the McDonoughs, and it's a great story. An auto salesman from Van Ness Auto Row said that a good-looking blonde in a convertible drove into the lot, gave him a big bag of gold coins, $1,100 worth of gold coins, and Brady came in the next day and drove the car off the lot. And I don't know if it was Dolly, but they said good-looking blonde, and she was often described as a very attractive woman. He had to, Matthew Brady, he had to deny and obfuscate because he had that $1,100 loan for a car. So everybody quit, the police commission quits, everybody resigns. Okay, this one is when Dolly returns to the front page. She had a house on Bush Street, 1275 Bush. I have pictures of it. And her maid let 8 young men into the house. They had come from a cotillion. They were in tuxedos. They were from some of the nicest families up in Pacific Heights. One of their mothers had overheard on the phone. They said, after the cotillion, we're going to Dolly's. And she was upset, and she called the police. The police followed the boys to Dolly's, waited about 10 minutes, and then raided the house. And luckily, they were all in the back parlor waiting because it was such a busy night. But Dolly was arrested. The whole house was raided. The boys were ushered out really quickly and sent home, and their parents were told. And this begins the larger part of Dolly's story, because she was indicted on contributing to the delinquency of minors. First woman ever charged with it. It was a pretty new law, aimed at men mostly, but she was the first woman ever indicted under that law, and she was in trouble. Okay, I'll show you. I thought I'd show you that picture again. This one, she's younger. You can tell by the fashion. This is probably in the 20s. This is when she was a teenager. She was a lookout for a jewelry store robbery, but the jeweler was crooked too, and so nobody was ever prosecuted. There's another shot of Dolly's business card. She said that she hired out housemaids, but they didn't do windows. So here's her whole, I'm sorry these pictures aren't as great as they look on the computer screen, but like 6 women in a row, all covering their faces or hiding under furs, arrested. The madam was freed, the girls were all jailed. And so then there's that shot of Dolly, which they all like, close-up of a vice queen. This is when the 8 boys were arrested in her house. And this is San Francisco parents. They can't pass the buck. How do you explain it to your little boys? So anyway, Dolly was in very serious trouble. Then she jumped bail. She disappeared. And this is pretty funny because the Chronicle interviewed her, but they said, we won't share it with anybody. We'll keep it quiet. But then when she jumped bail, they said, oh, well, she broke the promise that she made to us. Sally Stanford called her the smartest madam in the racket. That was Dolly Fine, a hell of a wonderful gal. She was described as an attractive woman in her 30s with blonde brown hair, tall, shapely, and a real classy dresser. She was said to be among the first profit-sharing madams and signed her girls up for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's newly established Social Security system. She knew everybody and had complete protection from harassment through the McDonoughs. Her lawyer, Jake Ehrlich, who came when this happened, she hired Ehrlich. She hadn't needed a high-powered lawyer before that. He described her as beautiful, intelligent, articulate, and smart. Dolly Fine was a good-looking young woman who dressed smartly, bought good books, and read them and discussed them. She was born in Alaska and had a brother in town who owned a bar, but don't know much more about her. When the Chronicle said, well, she broke her promise and disappeared, so now we could share it, she said, it says, Dolly Fine, haggard, fearful, and at bay, wrestled with her code to decide which way to go. 4 courses were open to her. I can commit suicide, I can squeal, I can fight the case and plead my innocence before a jury, or I can run away. First of all, I want you to get this straight. I have lived most of my life by the code of the underworld. Whichever route I take, I'm going to go for first class. When I tell you I'm perfectly capable, under certain circumstances, of killing myself, don't think I'm being theatrical. I know this is a terrible rap. I know Dolly Fine can never operate in San Francisco again. They tell me I may have to go to jail for 16 years. It was 2 years for each boy, for each count. And she goes, I won't do that. There's nothing more pitiful in life than a prostitute who has risen from the street, tasted luxuries and liked them, and then finds herself once again in the gutter. If I go to jail for a long term, where do I stand? I come out broke. My friends have disappeared. I am a financial, moral, and physical ruin. No, Dolly Fine will not hold still for that kind of deal. That brings us to the next step. I can squeal, but I'm not a rat. I won't blow the whistle now. Sure, I know a lot about police graft. I could make it tough on a lot of people inside and outside the police department. But listen, Dolly Fine is not that kind. I have a code. The code says keep your mouth shut. I have lived by that standard, and I can't and I can't find it inside myself to change my stripes now. It goes on. Let me see. There's one other part I really liked. Well, Dolly Fine may be a sucker to stand for it and not fight back. Maybe she's a fool to take it without opening up and letting them have some of their own medicine. But that's not the way I'm going. Remember, one of the few things I have left is my reputation among my own kind of people. Do you think I'd let them down? That I'd turn the heat on for them and get it off myself? Sure, the spotlight is on Dolly now. I could talk and switch it. I could become forgotten in the screaming and yelling that would follow, but I won't. Then the reporter asked, isn't it a fact that you've paid for police protection at about $300 a month? Dolly demurred. I won't insult your intelligence by saying no, that it isn't a fact. Instead, I won't answer the question. So anyway, she was fodder for the papers for a while, but she disappeared. She was seen, actually the one that said Dolly Fine seen near San Francisco said there was a bar or a cafe right down the street from the Carmel Avenue house, which she was seen before she completely disappeared. According to the headlines, she went to Chicago, she was in San Diego, she crossed into Canada, she flew to Paris, but I don't think she left the state. Okay, I'll give you this shot again. There's the, where Dolly gets away from it all. There was a point when after she disappeared that a San Francisco Call reporter, I think I mentioned this, reporter and a photographer got into the house, snapped photographs of her. I don't think the picture is very good. That's her bedroom, and that's one of the other bedrooms. There's a big life-size doll on the bed. So this reporter went back and wrote this somewhat lurid description of Dolly's house. It says, come along and see the house that Sin built, the house of Madam in Sharp Park. Drive down the long gravel road to the beach. Park outside the off-white home trimmed with blue. Press the doorbell. There will be no jangling of a cheap bell. Instead, the soft tones of chimes ring through the empty rooms. Then, reminiscent of the occupation of the owner, a tiny peephole springs open and a caretaker peers out. He opens the doors. You enter a long hall. Walk down to a living room overlooking the sea. Walk across the deep oriental rug. Survey the soft cushioned easy chairs and the rich toned paintings. Stand in front of the massive stone fireplace and look through a set of draped windows at the sea that murmurs at the border of the lawn. Down the hall to the guest bedroom, bed covered with ruffled lavender satin spread, soft silken pillows scattered in profusion about the bed, even in the corners of the room. Great mirrors reflecting the luxury that fills the chamber. A dressing table covered in gleaming cut glass and polished metal fittings. Across the hall, a bath, glassed-in shower, pastel tile, and gleaming fixtures. Ankle-deep rugs on the floor. Great soft towels and shades blending with the walls and the fittings. Okay, and then back to another corner room, a gleaming lacquer red bar, festooned with gilt dragons, stand beneath a huge mirror. The walls are red, the chairs are red, the curtains all the shade of the lady who built the madam's house. So they had a field day with Dolly. So her friend said she may return and tell all. So she came back. That's her completely shrouded in veils, which she showed up in court. She came back after 89 days on the lam, because if she'd stayed out for 90 days, she would have lost her $1,000 bail. But she came back and decided to face the music. And she hired Jake Ehrlich, there's 4 famous lawyers came out of this period. They were all scruffy, young, that's Ehrlich right there, lawyers who were hanging around the courts, getting $10 out of this defendant, $25 out of that defendant. Jake Ehrlich, who was the model for a lawyer show. I can't remember. It was before Perry Mason. But the other lawyers were Melvin Belli, Vincent Hallinan, and Governor Brown. But anyway, so Ehrlich, in his autobiography, claims it was his idea, but the newspapers were also wondering, how is Dolly going to get off? She's got 8 charges of underage boys in her brothel. Well, the papers had suggested that maybe the parents were going to get subpoenaed to come down and prove that their sons had actually been corrupted. And like I said, Ehrlich in his biography is riddled with half-truths and mistakes. And so he said he bought the veils for Dolly, but he subpoenaed all 8 parents the morning of her first trial, and he had process servers all over Pacific Heights, and they weren't going to show up. But he stood up in front of the court and said, how do we know that they were actually corrupted? Because 1 or 2 of the boys had said that their father had introduced them to prostitution previous to this, and so the district attorney was livid. He was probably had smoke coming out his ears. They had a conference in the judge's chambers. Judge came out and said, he gavelled it in. He wasn't going to allow the parents to have to come down and testify about how corrupted their children had become by Dolly. So she got 60 days for disturbing the peace or something, and they actually let her out before Thanksgiving. She was in the jail in San Bruno, up above 280, and the sheriff had been letting people out before Thanksgiving, so she only served about 55 days, and kind of disappeared from the scene after that. This comes out of Ehrlich's book. She bought him a plaque. It said, "To the master," that was his nickname, Jake Ehrlich, a great attorney and appreciation from Dolly Fine, 1938. And Ehrlich said that she ended up becoming a Pacific Heights matron, married into a wealthy family, and pretty much disappeared. But we don't know what happened to Dolly after she got out. She closed up her buildings. Then the state of California went after the bail bonds industry, but it was the end of the reign of the McDonough brothers. He had enough enemies by this time that he never got his bail bonds license back. He died in 1948. Had a funeral at St. Mary's. And then the Atherton report disappeared within a year from the county clerk's office. Assistant district attorney went to a judge and had the special supplement that the Chronicle and Examiner had published declared to be the true Atherton report, so that's where I found it. But in the late 90s, I had the luck of working for a historian that was doing pollution histories. And when I was working for him, I did a lot of newspaper searches, and I just started to see these big fat banner headlines about the Atherton report that got me started on this story. And that is it. Oh, and in the end, according to Ehrlich, though impossible to verify, Dolly Fine is now the unknown and anonymous wife, as far as her past is concerned, of a prominent businessman. Her hobby is civic improvement. So that's the last quote I get from that I have on her.